He contributed to several long-term research projects, including Jamestown Rediscovery and the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. Dr. Fessler received his master's degree in American history at the College of William and Mary and his PhD in anthropology at the University of Virginia. Yay. I know we're all eager to hear the latest update on his research into the free Black communities of 19th century Alexandria. So with that, I will turn it over to Garrett.
Tonight, I am really looking forward to sharing with you about the research that I've been working on, and bear with me as I try to advance the slide. There we go. Oops. And so I appreciate everybody choosing to spend an hour of your evening, and I hope it'll be an interesting one. We're going to be engaging with an important chapter in Alexandria's history, and that is of Alexandria's free Black community, with a particular focus on 46 individuals who signed a unique petition in the aftermath of the Nat Turner uprising. So I've always been a firm believer that the past and the present are significantly intertwined, and that looking back at our history can help us to guide us towards a better future. And you can see from the slide, apparently Shakespeare and Churchill agree with that sentiment. So I'm in pretty good company. So much of the research that I'm going to share with you about the 46 petitioners, I believe is relevant to today's equal justice movements. So that is goal number one tonight, to kind of talk about past and present and how they come together. I'm also a firm believer that archaeological research can be more than window dressing for historical studies, and that it can shine a light on areas of our past that would otherwise be overlooked. But rather than tell you how artifacts inform us about the past, I'm going to take you behind the curtain and show you how archaeologists like myself do our research and reach our conclusions from artifacts about the past. So archaeological interpretation is both a science and an art, and it involves bouncing back and forth between documentary evidence and archaeological evidence, using each source to inform the other to find the best fit explanation of people and events in the past. So let's dive right in. The story begins more than 200 miles to the south of Alexandria in Southampton County, Virginia. In the early morning hours of August 21st, 1831, an enslaved man named Nathaniel Turner and a core group of followers rampaged across the county for nearly 2 days, killing more than 55 white people. Within about 36 hours, the white authorities had quelled the uprising, killing or arresting several dozen Black men. Turner escaped and went into hiding, and he was able to avoid detection for nearly 2 months before he was eventually caught and tried and hanged. News of the uprising reached Alexandria in the local newspaper you see here on August 27th, 6 days after it had begun. As news trickled in over the next week, a 31-year-old free Black Alexandria resident named James Evans did not remain idle. He was a brickmaker by trade, and he owned 6 properties worth $3,100 in the city of Alexandria, making him one of the wealthiest Black occupants of the town. Although in his heart, we'll never know, Evans may have secretly approved of the violence in Southampton, he viewed the insurrection as a potential threat to his livelihood. And in a matter of 2 weeks, Evans had drafted a petition that pledged to defend the authorities of the town against all quote unquote enemies, and to promptly alert authorities should they hear of any conspiracies. Evans got 45 other free Black Alexandrians to sign the petition. 189 years later, in the late spring of 2020, Two young Black Alexandria residents, Hermela Abadi and Tita Ferreira, saw the press coverage of the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers, and they took action. 2 days after Floyd's death, Abadi told Ferretti that she wanted to organize a peaceful protest. 5 days later, they gathered at City Hall to make their voices heard. Quote, "It was a really spontaneous idea," unquote, said Ferretti. As the word of their protest became known, people rallied to their cause. Quote, "People I haven't even spoken to in years are messaging me and just asking how they can help. It's a nice community effort," unquote, she added. On the face of it, a violent uprising in 1831 and a police killing in 2020 should seem to have little in common, especially in Alexandria, far from where both events occurred. One involves a rare moment when a group of enslaved people coordinated an attack on oppressors, and the other represents an egregious example of law enforcement officers murdering a Black man in broad daylight. What these two seemingly dissimilar events do share is that they changed history. These events prompted countless people to act. In 1831, James Evans responded to news of the Turner insurrection by organizing his community to protect themselves. And in 2020, Hermela Abadi and Tita Ferretti responded to the killing of George Floyd by bringing their community together to peacefully yet forcefully speak out against systemic racism and police violence. Both Evans and Abadi and Ferretti, separated by almost 200 years, became leaders of social movements in Alexandria. Now, James Evans has spent his young life establishing a thriving business in the construction trade. He was a brickmaker, a brick mason. He was highly involved in the construction trade. And his customer base was mostly white. News of the Southampton uprising raised the anxieties of white people across the slave South. And Evans likely reasoned that a city full of anxious white residents was bad for business and bad for his safety and that of the free Black community. His response was to draft a petition. It was a defensive maneuver intended to ease white tensions before they could manifest into retribution. After all, back in Southampton County, in response to Nat Turner's uprising, white authorities killed more than 200 innocent Blacks, both enslaved and free, in a surge of frantic carnage. Evans may have anticipated something of this sort happening in Alexandria if concerns escalated. The petition that Evans crafted conveyed two main points to the white residents of town, and they were meant to tamp down tensions. One, and there's a phone, one, that Evans and the other signers would not join a slave revolt if it were to occur in Alexandria. And two, they said that they would inform on any slaves plotting an uprising. Reading between the lines, I think what Evans and his cohort were saying to the city's white leaders and citizens was, our Blackness at this moment in time does not define us, but our freedom does. And when forced to choose, we place our status as free citizens above our racial heritage. This must have been an emotional position to take for some of the petitioners, to publicly disavow enslaved members of their community and their families. Indeed, three of the signers, Dennis Carpenter, Simon Turley, and Thomas Valentine, had gained their freedom within just the past year. Other petitioners, such as Daniel Bruce, Henry Darnell, Nathaniel Lucas, William Roberts, and the newly freed Turley, had purchased the freedom of wives and siblings and children in the recent past. The petition laid bare in just 2 sentences the the Du Boisian sense of double consciousness that each of these 46 men confronted daily. The sense of straddling two worlds must have been ever present for many of them, which makes me wonder if some free Black men chose not to sign the petition when given the chance because they were being forced to choose. Moreover, I wonder if the petition may have caused a division within the Black community between signers and non-signers. That's something that we don't know at this point, and it may be something that we can explore by looking at historical records more deeply. Now, let's turn to kind of the second topic of tonight's talk, which is talking about excavation and how archaeologists do their work. As a method of inquiry, excavation comes in many forms. For historical archaeologists, the form of excavation that garners the most attention is when, of course, we excavate ground. And that's what gets all the attention. That's what everybody loves. But we also excavate historical documents. And by that, I mean we interrogate documents and texts to find the underlying structure and meaning of them, looking for patterns and connections, much like an archaeologist approaches and excavates the artifacts and layers and features of an archaeological site. So the first step here is to excavate James Evans' petition to try to better understand the men that put their names to it and their connection with one another. So my first step towards dissecting this petition was to geographically map each of the 46 signers. And to do this, I consulted the 1830 and 1831 land tax lists, as well as the 1830 federal census. Instead of listing the taxpayers alphabetically, beginning in 1808, the tax assessor walked all 4 wards of the city, noting the street face of each property. This means that the route the assessor took can be recreated, and the owners and occupants of each individual lot can be identified from year to year. So what you see in front of you is one of the pages from one of the tax lists, and the tax assessor is telling you where he is on the block. He's at Duke. And then he gets to the corner of Duke and Columbus, and then he goes down Columbus, gets to Alfred and Duke. So this is a really important document that helps us to actually put people on the ground in the city year by year. And you can also notice that I've highlighted the fact that the people that are listed on this tax list, they were also listed if they were Black. So we were able to pick up more individuals in the free Black community by using this tax list. All right, let's move on. So let's see, where am I? So by this means, tax lists and other documents, we've been able to identify the location of where 42 of the 46 petitioners resided in 1831. You see that here. So for this excavation, this is essentially the site map of our site that you see here. The research so far indicates that 4 of the signers lived outside the city limits, but likely worked in town and were able to sign the petition along with, or that was presented to them by James Evans. Visualizing where most of the petitioners lived gives us a sense of the physical proximity among them. Based on the dissertation research by Belinda Blomberg in 1988, we can map the free Black neighborhoods that began to materialize in the 1830s, and you see them here in purple. Neighborhood boundaries, of course, are fluid and not fixed, but we can see that in general, most of the petitioners lived in or near one of the 5 main neighborhoods, with a small number of individuals living in less developed areas to the south. Interestingly enough, James Evans happened to live on the outskirts of the city, where he owned 5 houses on 5 lots worth $2,500 in 1831. Evans clearly was the author of the petition. His name is in the John Hancock position on the petition in the newspaper, and it was Evans who presented and represented the group in February 1832 when he put the petition before the city council. The order of signatures suggests to me that Evans walked his petition around town over the course of about a week. If we assume that the order of signers reflects a personal connection between individuals adjacent on the petition, we can make some guesses about how the four men living outside of town fit into the social network. Surely, Evans didn't knock on 45 doors, but likely visited public places where men worked and congregated. By looking at where some of the signers are clumped in the order, Evans seems to have made several trips around town with the petition. He seems to have picked up about a dozen signatures on one loop through the Bottoms neighborhood that you see here. He may have visited the Hayti neighborhood twice and the Berg as well, which is in the kind of the upper right of the map. And on his various trips, he passed through the Uptown neighborhood and seems to have also picked up additional signers. So the main determinant of who signed the petition seems to have been James Evans himself. So to some degree, this that you see here is his social network. And interestingly, his social network was diverse and included men from all stations of life. The group included property owners, property renters, and tenants. You see them kind of the division or the groups of them up here on this part of the slide. Let's see, where am I? So far, I've been able to identify the ages of 28 of the petitioners. And as you see here, the mean age was 40 years old and the median age was 37.5 years. Alfred Hines was the youngest signer at age 24. And old Ben Cryer was the eldest at age 62. Based on the ages, the average petitioner was in his late 30s or early 40s. And he was married and raising children. He had responsibilities beyond himself to think about. And not surprisingly, ages of the 7 property owners skewed older, including the 2 oldest petitioners, Cryer and Henry Darnell. So far, the occupations of 18 of the petitioners have been identified. They span from skilled tradesmen such as potters, coopers, and bakers, to service workers such as draymen and clothes cleaners, to shopkeepers. Also, my guess is that some of the signers were known to James Evans because of their involvement in the building trades, such as bricklayers, carpenters, or day laborers. Now, before moving on, let's briefly compare some of the trends with the total population of 241 other free Black heads of households on the 1831 tax list to see where these groups might converge or might differ. Right off the bat, it appears that the petitioners as a group have a somewhat higher economic standing compared to their peers in the general population. Roughly 10% more of the petitioners own their own properties compared to the other free Blacks in town. This might not sound like a big difference, but at this early stage in research, what we're looking for are trends, not final conclusions. There is much work to be done in comparing these two groups, hopefully with the eventual outcome that we can begin to form some rigorous research questions that we can then take out into the field and do some archaeology. Hey, archaeology, aha, it's the magic word. We're finally going to talk about archaeology. Now, some of you may have been wondering, where does archaeology fit into all of this? And that's a fair question. The documentary research is the first step towards implementing an archaeological project. So let's go behind the curtain now and think about how archaeological excavation could add to this research. Before excavation can commence, archaeologists first need to identify two very important criteria: place and time. The research I have just shared with you has identified 42 places where free Black petition signers lived in 1831. So 42 places where these men and their households generated physical evidence of their presence in the form of artifacts, presumably. But our window of time, it's extremely tight. It's just 1 year, 1831. And because our window of time is so short, the possibility of finding artifacts that entered the archaeological record over that 12-month period is really, really unlikely. And realistically, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, and we don't have the permission to go to all 42 of these lots and excavate. So what we need to do to create an archaeological project that will be more likely to yield results is by widening that window of time and reducing the number of places. So that's what we're going to do here. So let's whittle it down, our universe of possible archaeology sites, to the 12 petitioners who own their properties, based on the presumption that they were more likely to occupy those properties for a long duration. We can do background research on each of these properties to find out when each of the petitioners purchased them and for how long they own them, hopefully widening the window of time. So I've chosen one at random. I literally chose this just the other day to see what would happen. So this is all very brand new. I chose Andrew Bell. And our interest is to establish the amount of time that Bell and his family lived on that property that you see there on the map. Now, it turns out, I was shocked by this, Bell purchased the lot and house from Polly Turner in 1818. And he lived there until his death in late 1831. He may have died almost exactly around the time that the Nat Turner uprising was coming to a head in terms of when they arrested Nat Turner. So we know he was alive, obviously, in October to sign the petition, but he probably was not alive when his friend James Evans presented the petition to the city council in February 1832. Anyways, that was a little sidelight there. Now, he lived on this property until 1831, and his wife, Mary Bell, subsequently occupied the house and lot for 3 more years up until 1834. So our window for Andrew Bell and his wife, Mary, has widened to 1818 to 1834. Now, beginning in 1835, Mary Bell continued to own the property, but she did not reside there and rented it out to free Black tenants. So we have a decision to make here to expand our research focus from the Bell family exclusively to more generally free Black residents. If we're willing to do that, then when Mary Bell rented the property out, she did so until 1843, when it was sold to a man named Samuel Bartle, who was a white carpenter. So, and if we're really expanding the research focus to free Blacks in general, then we can open up that window back on the property to at least 1807, when Polly Turner, a free Black woman, lived on the property. And Polly Turner, I can't wait to try to look into her life. She seems to have worked as a cook in 1808 in a local tavern, and she was the only free Black person listed in the tavern, which makes me think that she may have been the cook or the chef that was featured at the tavern. Just a complete guess on my part, but something that that we hope to really drill down on and learn more about Polly Turner. So, with the period of time and the place determined, now we can begin thinking about the property itself, which you see here. And we are in luck. The property is not overdeveloped. It appears to have a fairly large yard space. You can see that over here. And the building appears to be original to the lot. There is definitely a possibility that archaeological remains are located on this lot that relate to Polly Turner, to Andrew and Mary Bell, and to other free Black occupants. So this is where archaeological context comes in. The term that you see here, or the definition of it, it's a long definition. The term means the location of an artifact in the archaeological record. So simply put, not all artifacts are created equal. By this, I mean that the informative value of each artifact depends on where it is located in the ground in relation to other artifacts, soil layers, and built elements. So archaeologists often rank different kinds of archaeological contexts. And just to cut right to the chase, the best contexts are also sometimes known as sealed contexts, which means that the artifacts have not been moved from the original location where they were put, placed, or ended up in the ground. So let's imagine a scenario. Mary Bell is cleaning up her kitchen one evening in 1831 and collects the food waste and trash in a bucket, including the pieces of a broken teacup. And she lugs the bucket out into the yard and dumps it up against a side yard fence. So what you're seeing is sort of a ground level view in scenario one here of that teacup being placed sort of in a pile on the ground. Now, over time, she deposits more trash there, and time passes and animals muck around with it or in it. Rainstorms cause it to settle. And several years later, someone ends up putting in a planting bed along the fence. And eventually, a small shed is built, and the teacup fragment is displaced several times after it came out of Mary's bucket. So 200 years later, an archaeologist is digging in the yard and uncovers a teacup fragment in a shallow layer mixed with other debris and artifacts, some of which date to the later 19th and 20th century. So it's mixed up. Because the context of the teacup has changed so dramatically since it was tossed into the yard by Mary Bell, its informative value is limited. For one, we have no way of knowing that Mary was the one that broke the teacup, or that she used it in the past before that, and that she put it in the ground. All we can say for certain is that this teacup fragment ended up in the yard of this property at some point in the past. And given the close quarters of the urban environment, the teacup could have come from one of the neighboring properties as well. All right, so let's think of a second scenario. This is the one that we want to have happen all the time. This time, Mary dumps her bucket with the broken teacup fragments into an old tree hole in the yard. Later that night, there was a heavy downpour and a thick layer of silt settled on top of the debris in the hole. Over the next several weeks, the hole is gradually filled in with soil, effectively sealing the bucket of trash under layers of silt, creating a sealed context. You kind of see this happening here. And there the artifacts remained, not having moved from the moment they spilled out of Mary Bell's bucket for the next 200 years until those pesky archaeologists excavated a test unit there. And this is all speculative. Although the archaeologists would not know that Mary Bell was the person that put the trash in that hole, they can analyze the teacup and the other artifacts in the hole with it. It turns out the teacup had a distinctive decoration on it that dated it to between 1820 and 1825. And combined with some of the identifiable artifacts with it, they could pinpoint that the artifacts must have been deposited in that hole before 1835. So they return to the background research and confirm, aha, that's when Andrew and Mary Bell lived on the property between 1818 and 1834. So, meaning there is a high likelihood that the artifacts in this feature came from their household sometime between 1820 and 1835. So this is why context matters. All right, I've been talking a long time. I'm going to wrap it up. We're going to talk about next steps. So my goal tonight was to convey to you some main takeaways. For one, I hope I've illustrated how historical documents and archaeological data can work in tandem to better understand the past. Ideally, documentary digging can guide us to properties where free Black Alexandrians resided so we can conduct archaeological digging. Documents, like the petition, can help us refine our search and develop research questions. I also hope I have shown you how difficult urban archaeology can be. So, and to get good data out of the ground, it takes hard work and diligence and, quite honestly, a fair amount of luck. So where do we go from here? Now, as I said earlier, excavation takes many forms, right? Not necessarily by using shovels and trowels. The city of Alexandria happens to have one of the largest historical archaeology collections in the country, the result of a half-century of excavation. All the artifacts that were dug when Pam Cressy was here, and when Fran Bromberg was here, and Steve Shepard was here. That was a lot of digging over the years. And as you all, many of you know, much of the digging took place in the 70s during the city's urban renewal phase. That work generated tens of thousands of artifacts, artifacts that quietly reside in hundreds of Hollinger boxes in our curation facility, just waiting for an eager archaeologist to find them again. Wrong curation facility. There we go. That's us. Better. Now, how many of those artifacts relate to free Black residents of the city? Well, with one of the largest free Black populations in the country in the first half of the 19th century, I'd say that the odds are good that a significant percentage of those artifacts resulted from the actions of free Black and enslaved people. Of course, identifying sealed contexts linked to specific households is terribly difficult in urban settings, as I've shown. But I'm optimistic that there are sealed contexts in some of those boxes. So it's time for us to dust off the lids of those boxes and give it a try. If we are up to the challenge, an excavation of those collections almost certainly would reshape our understanding of free Black Alexandria. All right, coming to the end. When I started this project, I wanted to believe that 46 free Black men who presented a petition of their allegiance to Alexandria's mayor and city council were acting as social justice warriors. Now I'm not so sure that that is an accurate assessment of the petition. The fact that they were compelled to have to publicly state their loyalty to their own community speaks volumes about the vulnerability of their lives. And it reminds me of what I imagine many Black Americans still feel today. Social justice involves both pushing forward and pulling back. And I'm reminded of how the Black Lives Matter movement constantly must define that its goal is to support Black lives, not to oppose white lives. And frankly, by naming the movement Black Lives Matter and leaving off the two, this is an ingenious way to force people to think about vulnerability. Maybe in some ways, the petition was a precursor to Black Lives Matter. Maybe James Evans understood that sometimes the best offense was playing a good defense, to protect what you have and keep clawing ahead. thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Garrett. That was amazing. I love how you tied it up to our future as well. And I feel like this could be a series. You can pick out all those different people and keep telling us stories about all of them. So interesting.
I agree. I feel like, each month we could spotlight another household and see what we get. Because I'm not lying. I only began looking at Andrew Bell's household like 2 days ago in preparation for this. And I thought, I, I didn't know what I was going to find, but I didn't expect there to be an open lot in the yard that really could be pretty interesting archaeologically. So I agree. I'm all for it. Let's spotlight people each month and go for it.
Sounds cool. Well, we did get a question from LJ Jordan. This is really cool. I like this one. They said, I just did an internet search for James Evans and found he was a founder of the group of African-American members of the Trinity Methodist Church who planned to purchase land for their own church, but were delayed by the Nat Turner Rebellion. I know church records are a common resource for genealogy. Do they also support archaeology research?
Very much so. That's a great point and a great question. And in fact, I have begun working with another of our Office of Alexandria, of Historic Alexandria folks who she has her hands on a whole bunch of the Trinity Church records. And so we've been beginning to collaborate. And we haven't really had a chance to really sit down and hash it out. But the Association of African Americans with local churches was such an important aspect of their lives and their history. And we would absolutely, we need to fold those sources into our research, definitely. And there's a lot in there, I think, that can really open up some windows of understanding. So definitely, the Trinity Church records and others in the local community are really important.
Great. We also had a question about how did this project come about?
Well, there's a couple factors, I think. Just on a personal note, I've always been interested in the history and circumstances of the Nat Turner Rebellion. So about 5 years ago, I sort of decided that that was going to be my nightly reading. And I began reading about it and learning more about it. And I actually started really getting involved in researching the sort of the backstory of the Nat Turner Rebellion. And by that, I mean, I was really interested in identifying the locations of the actual farms that Nat Turner and his followers visited during the uprising, and trying to understand why they went to different farms and why they chose to go to some places and why they did not visit others. That research is still ongoing. I think I've uncovered some really new and interesting information about that. But over the past year, during all of the social justice movements that have begun to really arrive and make a difference in all of our lives for the better, I felt like I wanted to try to put myself into some research that that was supporting this in some way. I know that in many cases, being an historian or an archaeologist, it feels very detached from the present day, but I wasn't just sort of talking talk when I say that I really do believe that the past is connected with our present and our future in very, very important ways. And I wanted to sort of begin to think those out. So the petition being connected with the Nat Turner uprising, which has always been of interest to me, and then the petitioners being Alexandria residents where I work, really set me on a course of research that was important to me. And then I would say the other element that sort of is behind all this is that our city archaeologist, Eleanor Breen, sort of sat down with all of us in Alexandria or Alexandria archaeology, and we began to try to map out we want to be doing research and archaeology that is anti-racist, and so we've begun mapping out a program to try to accomplish that. And this is kind of, for me, this is sort of my first foray into trying to make that happen.
I like it. When you were doing your research, what kind of things surprised you that you found?
There was both. I was both encouraged and also discouraged. And I was encouraged because, like with the example of Andrew Bell and Mary Bell, I think as the research goes forward, we're going to begin to find that the footprint that people like the Bells left is greater than we thought. I didn't have a lot of hope that I would be able to find out much about Andrew Bell, and I think what I've found is that no, that there's still there very well may be archaeological artifacts there on his property, and so I find that, you know, obviously very optimistic. The element that I found that is sort of caused me some pessimism is that for folks who did not own their own land, what I'm seeing in the records, the year by year tax lists, is a lot of movement. And so the majority, and this is going to need to, I'm going to need to put more research into this. But what I'm seeing is that the majority of free Black Alexandrians were moving from year to year frequently. And what that tells me is that for many people, they lacked the ability to be able to put down roots, to sort of call a place home and to make it something that was more than just a stopover place. And so I think that was, interesting to me, concerning to me, but also because from the sense of archaeologists or doing archaeology, that makes those people were leaving small archaeological footprints all over town. If we trying to find them in the ground is going to be impossible. So that for me was sort of like a bracing moment of discovery, like, oh my gosh, many of these people did not have the opportunity to really put down roots and settle and grow their families, but they were on the move.
So one of the questions that someone put in the chat or with Q&A had to do sort of with what you were talking about with Mr. Bell there, and you were looking at the house that he lived in with Polly owning it. And this person, Kathleen Baker, she was saying she got goosebumps at the conclusion of the presentation. And she was saying, sorry, one of the questions went away. She lived on this is Barbara Morganfield. She lives on South Royal Street and was wondering how to determine how get the ownership of the lineage of the house. Like, how did you do that with Polly and finding out that she owned that house?
Really, it was just a matter of, we had this very fortunate circumstance, which is someone about 50 years ago made photocopies of all of the land tax records for the city of Alexandria from 1787 to 1855. the copies themselves are, sometimes they're in really hard shape and they're very difficult to read. But nevertheless, in our office, we have drawers of all of these tax lists. And so I was able to discover, and I didn't, because I just embarked on looking at the Andrew Bell lot just a few days ago. I didn't have time to really look into Polly Turner, but I think there's, like I said in the presentation, I really think there could very well be a really interesting story about her, and I'm anxious to sort of get busy looking at that. But to answer the question, so it's a matter of going through the tax lists year by year and searching through the the scripts and finding that property each year. So that's literally what I did with the Bell property, or the Polly Turner property before that. Was I looked in 1818 and noticed that the property had changed from Polly Turner to Andrew Bell. So I know that she sold them the property. I haven't yet, I didn't have time to look at the deeds, but that'll be the next step, is to look for the deed of sale between the two of them and then trace that out. So this could be done on any lot in Old Town, on any street in Old Town that was under the purview of the tax collector. And my big hope is to kind of try to wrap our arms around the whole town and be able to have lot histories for every household, every lot in Alexandria. That would take an enormous amount of work, but at the very least, what I'm hoping to do is establish an understanding of the town in the 1830s, and especially focused on what free Black Alexandrians were doing and where they were living, how they were networking, and sort of trying to get connections between people, as well as begin to understand where we might be able to initiate some archaeology.
Great, thanks. Paula Whitaker has a question as well. She was curious about where is the actual petition, and did people know about it before, or does it actually exist?
That's a really good question. I have not laid eyes on the original, so I honestly do not know if it exists. What I do know is that it was published in the newspaper about 2 weeks after the uprising. And so that's what you see on the screen is the published version of it. I also know that James Evans presented this petition to the city council in February 1832. I have not had the opportunity or haven't been able to look and see if that exists in the records for 1832. It's definitely something that would be important to this work. And so consider it, Paula, something on the list where we definitely need to find whether there's an actual handwritten copy of the petition.
And so what's next for the project? What are your next steps?
Well, the next stuff that I'm really looking at is because I'm really interested in this idea of movement, and having, I mean, it's something that we all understand, right? Some of us, especially in military families, grew up where we moved from place to place frequently, and that definitely has an impact on the lives of people who move a lot. And there's also an impact of people who are able to put down roots and live for a long time in one place. And I feel like I've kind of done both. I didn't grow up in a military family, but over the course of my life, I've probably moved a dozen times. And I mean, and this is probably getting too personal, but I'm not sure that I've ever felt like I really belonged in the community that I'm in. I love living here in Alexandria, but I still don't know that I feel like this is my place. Anyways, my desire is to really trace out the movement of all the free Black residents of the town. And my window of tracing movement is between 1828 and 1833. So I've tried to bookend the 1831 date as sort of kind of the centerpiece. And I'm in the middle of going through all the tax lists and identifying the locations of each of those free Black residents. I've got spreadsheets that will make, scramble your brain, and I'm adding to them. And I hope by towards the end of the year, this year, I'll be able to present a new presentation on my findings of sort of looking at this window of 5 or 6 years to look at movement and activity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Garrett. Emma, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Lori. And of course, thank you, Garrett. It was really exciting to hear about. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us tonight. If you want to revisit tonight's talk, or if you want to share it with folks that weren't able to make it tonight, we'll have a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel soon, I promise. If you'd like to keep up with our latest research and work that we're doing, please follow us on social media. That's where we put out little snippets as we find fascinating things along the way. And join us in June, because that will be our second in the Archaeology After Dark series. We're going to have Dr. Benjamin Skolnick, and he's going to be sharing his research into the 1803 to 1804 logbook of the schooner Enterprise that was based in Alexandria. So he's going to follow 4 voyages that the Enterprise makes, and that'll give us a glimpse of what that world was like. Also, if you're in the Alexandria area, our museum is now open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. So you can always come out to the 3rd floor of the Torpedo Factory and visit us, see what we've been up to. And with that, see you hopefully in June.